about 6:15. So, but please continue to eat, and I think there's still probably plenty of soup, and desserts and salad are all left too. So please feel free to get up and get what you might need. But before we begin this portion, how about let's join together in a word of prayer. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Holy God, we give you thanks for this day and for this opportunity to come together in conversation and fellowship. We give you thanks for all those who have built St. Mark's into the congregation that we are today. And we ask you to open our eyes and ears and hearts and minds to the ways that you are still working in and among us today. We ask all this through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. So this week, first, most of this information was thanks to Karen and the newsletter articles that she wrote in 2017. And I know some of you also, some others helped her, but she was a part of that. So that was very helpful to me as the newcomer and learning the history. So if I get something wrong, it's obviously my fault. But I also think that this is probably going to be a bit more audience participation because there were some holes that I didn't have information for. And I'll be looking to some of our more longer term members to help me with that. So, talking about the historic identity of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. So how did St. Mark's Lutheran Church begin? How did we start? And what have been the major parts of our history? And how does this history inform our present now today? So, beginnings. In the early 1940s, a small group of neighbors wanted a Lutheran church in Bellefonte area. And so they said, we're going to start a church, which they did. And the first service was held on January 1st, 1942. 11. What?
11.
January 11th. Oh, sorry. It's what, January what? Did I get the wrong date?
You said January 1st.
Oh, sorry. January 11th is correct. Because that's what my brain just read 1-1. So, but there was no building. So at the time, we were meeting in the Brandywine 100 Fire Company second floor social hall. And it sounds like it was a pretty exciting time because occasionally when the fire alarm would go off, it was very chaotic, and apparently the pastor had to stop doing whatever he was doing so to let the firemen get out and go do and let the sirens do, and then he would just resume where he was. So, starting like many actually the church that I grew up in eastern Baltimore County was founded actually in the 1960s. They also started at a fire hall, so that must have been a popular place. I mean, a big area, probably made sense for that to be there. So, building a dedicated building. So after a few years, a vote was taken about establishing their own building, but there wasn't enough money to do it, and people said, no, we don't want to do this. If we can't pay for it, we're not going to do it. So in 1950, a local contractor, Fred Krepf Sr., whose name and picture is up here on the wall, offered the skilled labor to build a church on this property if church volunteers helped with the rest. So he provided the labor and volunteers provided what was needed. The women and the children provided meals and other support for the people who were building. So from the very beginning, people of this congregation were invested in, at least in the building, but also to me that says also to what was happening within the building. So then ground was broken at the beginning of May there in 1950, and this is a picture, I believe, from the first service, potentially, if not early. So the first service, though, was held on Christmas Eve, 1951, and what was notable about it was there was no heat. For Christmas Eve, no heat. So this might not be then because it doesn't look like anyone's wearing coats. So, I mean, you can tell that they're dressed nicely, but I don't see anyone really wearing overcoats at least. I see the men are wearing suit coats and the women are wearing suit coats, but yeah. So kind of taking all of that into mind, given what we know about the beginning of St. Mark's, what part or parts of that identity still affect our mission and ministry today?
The ability to call in volunteers.
The ability to call in volunteers.
I think the passion we have for our church here at St. Mark's, especially the people in this room.
Yes.
Not to get into something that we can't pay for.
Right. Yeah, right, yes. Yeah. Anything else? I mean, those are probably the three that I would have named there. Yeah. So as we know, or as we talked about, at least in the earlier weeks, the church is not just the pastor who is leading it, but that person is a part of the mission and ministry of the church, and as such, they affect it by the way that they are leaders. So, a brief history of our pastors here. First pastor was Pastor Miller, who served from August of 1942 to July of 1948, when he accepted a call in Silver Spring, Maryland, which I thought was interesting, at an Episcopal church in Silver Spring, Maryland, is where he went. Next was Pastor Inslee, who was here from 1949 to 1952. I think he was the shortest serving. I think he might be the shortest serving pastor. And I didn't have any information as to where he went after that.
He's the one I didn't know.
Yeah, he is the one that we didn't know. So also what I did was I went into the big book, the big membership book, which I found several of your names written when you were confirmed or joined in there. And so that had the information on where these pastors went, but they didn't say, it just said that he left, but not where he went. So the next pastor was Pastor Zimmerman, who was here for about 13 years, from 52 to 65, and then he was called by the Board of American Missions to Silesia, Maryland, which I don't know where that is, but that was in the book. That's what it said where he went. From there. Then we have, right, the man that, this is what he will forever look like to me, because growing up in this synod, he was bishop when I was growing up, or at least when I was in high school. And so this is the man that I remember. He served here from 62 to 78, so a fairly long 16 years. He began, though, as an associate pastor, and then when Pastor Zimmerman left, he became the senior pastor. And then he left to accept a call at Church of the Ascension in Baltimore.
And he was known as the voice.
He was known as the voice, yes. He had a very,
He didn't need those thinking speakers.
He did not. No, I remember that from youth, like when we would do like LYO and stuff, when we would go to that. I do remember that of him.
And how long was Zimmerman here?
Zimmerman was here for about 13 years. Yeah. So about 3 years he overlapped with Zimmerman. So then in that time between Zimmerman and Mako, there were 4 associate pastors too. So like you said, Mako was the first one. And then Buckwalter, who was here for 5 years. Holum, is that how you say his last name? Holum, okay. And O'Hara Shields, who were here for shorter amounts of time, but that is often what happens with associate pastors. They often don't stay for long times. At least she came directly from seminary. So, first call for her. That was followed by, please say his name. Sockladen, thank you. So, also another long-term pastor. He was here for just shy of 12 years. Before he went to St. John in Salisbury, North Carolina. which now I'm wondering if that's why I recognize his name, because I did my internship in Charlotte, North Carolina, so I wonder if I ran into him at some stuff, possibly. And that's where I recognize his name. But then while he was here, there was one associate, this lovely gentleman that we all know and love, who was here for about 4.5 years. And then, yeah. So if you can't tell, I took these pictures of the ones in the seminary rooms. These are pictures of pictures here. Longest serving pastor, right? 22 years. Thank you. I was quickly trying to
sermons too.
Long sermons. So, right. When he left, he retired. So he's still around. He still comes and joins us. Was followed by Pastor Scott, who was here for a very short time, which I'm going to actually talk about a little bit later. And he is still now in the synod in Linthicum. And then this person, which I do have a picture. There is a picture that's been taken. It just has not been printed and posted. It's a
great picture.
It's a great picture. Abby took this picture one day. So yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's why it's kind of coming from, this is by the sacristy. I think it was before worship or between worship services or something. She went to take my picture. So, and right now I've been here for about 9 months. So, and counting. So that's why I put a question mark. Not because I'm questioning how long I'm going to be here, but because we don't know. So, questions to consider. So what might we have learned about the number of pastors who have served St. Mark's? So formed in 1942, it is now 2023, so that is 81 years. We've had quite a few pastors. I mean, even if you take out the associate pastors, there have still been a good number of pastors. So yeah, sure.
I was going to say that most of them have served for a long time.
There were five of them that served over 10 years, and one served, like you said, 20 years.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And they were called to go places. They were called to go places.
Well, in some of those cases, I don't know how it worked. I don't know how it worked in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Now it is a decision by a pastor or to enter the call process. I mean, I was serving another church and I decided to enter the call process, which is how I ended up interviewing here and then ending up here.
Is that the same for bishop and all that?
Not for bishop. Bishop is an election by the assembly. So that's a different thing. But the way that bishop works is the first ballot is you just write down a name. It just has to be someone who is a pastor. It doesn't even have to be in the synod. You can write down your favorite pastor from Michigan to be the bishop of the Delaware, Maryland Synod. So that first ballot, of course, usually, unless it's a re-election of a bishop, generally can have hundreds of names, a bunch of whom are only going to get 1 or 2 votes. So then they contact all the people who are named, and you have the chance of taking your name off. It's the only time you can take your name off the election. So then they remove all those, and then there is a vote from there, and then you just keep whittling down from there. So it's yeah.
I'm just curious. But when you're in seminary school, do they discourage you from staying at a church for a long time? Or do they have a certain amount of time they feel?
Right. So there are, I would say no. There are pros and cons to that. There are pros and cons to a pastor staying for a long time, and there are pros and cons to a pastor staying only for a very short time. And there are many reasons why either of those things can happen. Especially today, where often if the pastor is married, they have a spouse whose job, might affect where and when they move and stay. If they have children, that might affect when and where they move and stay. The benefit of a pastor being in one place for a long time is that pastor really gets to know the congregation. And, you know, if you're only there for 2 or 3 years, you don't necessarily have the time to develop those relationships and, you know, to the extent of the pastor who's there for 22 years, right? But the cons are also that what happens after that long-term pastor leaves. So my first call, it was a very similar situation to here. My first call, they had a pastor for 39 years.
Wow.
He retired. It was the only call he ever served. Was that congregation? He retired. They called another pastor. He was there for like 2.5. He left, and then they called me, and I was there for about 4. And I probably would have stayed longer if I hadn't gotten married. So that situation there, at least there, was that the pastor in between me and the long-serving pastor, they couldn't make the distinction between that, you know, beloved former pastor and new pastor. When I came, there was enough time between that they were able to be open and welcoming and allowing me to enter into their lives. So that can sometimes be a con. You know, a con of that is that when a pastor serves a congregation for that long, sometimes things happen within that congregation that are more because the pastor's driving them. And so then when the pastor leaves, either by retiring or accepting a new call, those things might fall aside because the pastor was the one who was shepherding them. I think there's pros and cons to both. And I would say that seminary doesn't necessarily tell us one is better than the other, but tries to present to us that's the reality that is. I would say nowadays it's less likely to see those 20, 30, 40-year calls because we're much more mobile than we were in the 40s, 50s, and earlier. And like I said, and with now with more women working outside of the home too. So whether she is the pastor or her husband is the pastor or they're both pastors, like in our house, then you've got to negotiate that too. So,
I have a question.
Yeah.
In the Lutheran way is that whether a person stays or leaves is like up to the pastor and the congregation. Is that correct? As contrasted with the synod.
Yeah, so it's up to the pastor and then the congregation in terms of where that pastor is going to, the congregation that the pastor is going to.
Right.
So, so when I was interviewing with you all, there were a small handful of people at the congregation that I was serving that knew I was interviewing because they were serving as my references and things like that. But the congregation as a whole did not know. But ultimately, it was your choice here to call me to come to this place. So it was a mutual decision between a congregation and a pastor, but not the pastor and the congregation that I was serving.
So what my question is, does the synod ever push or put pressure on a pastor to stay and or to leave?
I would assume, I don't want to say no because there probably have been instances. And one instance of asking a pastor to consider leaving is, if it's just not a good fit or if things are going not great, right? I mean, there's a whole process in our Constitution of how to get rid of a pastor, but there are very specific things that you can remove a pastor for. And, if it doesn't fit, like, Robbie's first call, they did not like the fact that he didn't visit them as much as they wanted him to. He did a lot of visits, but it still wasn't enough for them. They could not remove him for that because that is not one of those things. So, and sometimes when this was several years before I interviewed with you all, I was in my call, I was not considering leaving. And sometimes paperwork comes to this bishop on the bishop's desks and they think of, say, this might be a good call for someone. That happened to me. I wasn't thinking about going anywhere. And this assistant to the bishop in Ohio had a meeting with me and just said, I want you to think about interviewing at this congregation. I did, and ultimately we decided that that was obviously not the place for me to be. But so sometimes that can happen as well. Yeah. But ultimately the decision to call a pastor lies with the congregation.
And the pastor.
And the pastor then also has to accept that call. Right. Yeah. So I think we kind of also we kind of talked a little bit about this, but what might we learn about the length of their service too? So was it 5 pastors who were 10 years or more? Is that what you counted? I don't have it.
I'm thinking it was 5.
Okay.
I'm thinking it was at least 5.
So,
Well, like you said, the 27, 28 years is way too long, I believe, to stay in one church. They get so set in their ways, and then when the new pastor comes in, there's
right. You're not Pastor Bob or whatever. Yeah. Yeah. So.
But maybe there's a need for that at that church.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they were so comfortable with that
Right.
pastor. Because there was a need and he or she served that need.
Right. Yeah. It's a difficult, as someone who's gone through this process recently, it's difficult to discern. Am I still called to be here or am I not? How do I know? Because there is never, you want that flashing sign, okay, it's time to move on. And there's not always that flashing sign that says it's time to move on, right? But yeah.
Well, that's one of the reason why our pastors, once they leave the church, like in Fred's case, he wasn't able to do funerals.
Right.
He wasn't able
It's
to do
that's part of that.
the
Yeah.
congregation, and he had to build a different kind of relationship. And for a period of time, he just has to be out of the picture.
Yes.
Now that doesn't necessarily mean that clears that issue, but.
And that can play out. That plays out. I saw that play out firsthand, because part of the reason why Robbie's first call ended the way that it did was because they could not let the previous pastor go, and so they kept. And he also would break those boundaries. So he would come back and do weddings and funerals, and and if Robbie said something that the congregation didn't agree with, they would contact that pastor and say, Pastor Robbie said blah, blah, blah. Is that right? And they'd be like, he would say, well, yes, that is right. And then they would come back and say, well, Pastor Robbie, since Pastor so-and-so said that's right, then we can do that, right? Yeah. So that's part of, right? Yeah. It was a mess. So so that is that's how it can go very poorly. Now, my first call, the pastor who was there for 39 years still lived in the neighborhood. Like, he was literally in the neighborhood. But he knew, and he had stayed away in that interim, not the interim pastor, but he basically was an interim, who was only there for a few years between me and him. But he intentionally stayed away for the first year that I was there. And then, and only then, did he reach out to me and me alone and just said, when and if you would like to, my wife and I would like to have you for dinner. And not to talk about the church, just to kind of welcome you to the area, all of that, which I think is a good way of handling that. Right. So, Barbara.
Probably the longer a pastor stays, the more difficult it is to transition, harder to let go. And, we've always done it before.
Right.
Always, but at least for the last X number of years.
Right.
And that sort of thing. We went through those transitions with each of the long-term pastors.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, because, just think about it. Some of you probably served in jobs for, 20, 30, 40 years in places, right? You built relationships with the people that you were working with. You got to know each other, and so you built a life that was part of your life for a significant portion of it. And pastors, I don't want to be on this soapbox for too long, but pastors, we're there at your intimate, like the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. I mean, that's when we're there with you, right? And you're there with us too. And you get to see, if we have children, you get to see them growing up. We get invested in the community by joining groups or by, doing things with our kids' schools or whatever, right? And so it's hard then too to that's why the flashing sign would be nice, because we get set in our ways too and don't recognize the signs of when it is time for us to move on.
What you're saying
Yeah.
is so similar to teaching.
Yeah.
Everything you're saying, I'm remembering
Okay,
and
yeah.
hearing, and
Yeah.
In flashbacks.
Yeah. So, well, let's get off of pastoral leadership for a minute here, and right, we can't talk about the history, right? I'm sure just those words for some of you probably brings some emotions and thoughts, right? Right. So reading some, which again, thank you to Karen for those newsletter articles, because that was a big help in putting this all together.
I was cutting cake, and I thought, I think I read that.
Yeah. So, but one of the things that that you wrote in there was that before the firefighters were gone, the women of the church were here cleaning up the mess. We were taking the medallions off the doors, cleaning the floors, seeing what could be salvaged. And the notion was, we built it once, we'll build it again. Which is that same, what we kind of talked about right before, when we talked about building the initial building. We built it once, we'll build it again. And then I think this is I'm sure it's an emotional picture for you, but I think this is just a devastatingly beautiful picture of, I'm sorry, he'll always be Bishop Mako to me. So of Bishop Mako and the firefighter standing in the ruins then of the church.
And the boots.
With that?
He's got the boots.
He's got the boots on, yeah. So, so after the fire, we met at Mount Pleasant Junior High School, which is now Mount Pleasant Elementary, that way, whatever, I'm turned around. Yeah.
For a while,
Yeah.
and then we went to Mount.
Yeah. So October 26, 1979, there was a meeting for funding the construction of the new building, and a building committee was formed. So note again, you didn't make the decision to build until you knew that you had the money to build, right? And then September 13th, 1970, the newly rebuilt church was dedicated. So, how did the devastation of the fire impact St. Mark's mission and ministry? Yeah, go ahead.
A former member, Pat Nodell, was telling me this story. I was interviewing her, and she said, as awful as that fire was, and how devastating it was, it totally changed the climate of St. Mark's, because the original church was built by this group of people, this small group. They were very close. I can imagine what it would be like coming home from work every day and laying brick or doing this and that. And it was like, this is our church. And as the church was growing, they still held on to it as, I'm glad you're here, but it is our church.
Yeah.
And she said after the fire, when it was all rebuilt, it became everyone's church. She said that was the feeling that was permeating throughout St. Mark's. And I thought, well, that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And it changed, the church was changed so much. I mean, because the front of the church.
Because it was flipped, right, yeah.
We had a freestanding altar, the chapel went away. It was totally redone.
Reconstructed.
Yeah. So, how has the legacy of the fire impacted our current mission and ministry? Anyone else super paranoid to make sure that all the candles are out when they leave?
How long did it take us to have
Like-
candles on Christmas Eve?
Oh, no, that happened right here.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
How many years did we not have handheld candles on Christmas Eve?
Well, we didn't, if they were on the end of when they were on the pews, they had the.
Yeah, we had them on the sides, but
Yeah, no,
we
we,
didn't have them in the pew.
Yeah, Cliff.
remember having them in the pews at home.
At the end of the meeting.
For me, that
Not at hand.
So Cliff was,
For me, that history tells us that we've gone through a number of episodes of death and rebirth. And it seems to me that in the current thing that we're wrestling with that too.
yeah,
In a heightened awareness.
right. That Phoenix window really
Right.
that really fits this congregation.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I will say there are a lot of similarities here as to other churches. So the last church that I served also had a massive fire, much more recent in 2005. But they chose to rebuild. And as I was going around and talking to people as I was leaving, and so going around saying my goodbyes to people, the man who had headed the rebuilding committee looked me in the eyes and says, "It was a mistake. We should not have rebuilt. We should have closed then and just joined with another congregation." But they were so into the building that they couldn't fathom anything else than rebuilding.
Couldn't
Yeah.
let it go.
Yeah. No. So that was how that fire affected them. No.
Well, I wasn't here for that rebuilding,
Yeah.
but I'm very touched by it. I really
Right.
am.
Yeah.
And the energy that went into so many things from that. So it wasn't a complacency at all.
Yeah.
And for all the saints that have come through this congregation, what they've given to people that are there, and then they give to somebody else, and there's. I feel that the Holy Spirit really dwells very richly in this congregation.
Yes.
And so it's more than the stuff.
Right. Yeah. So one of the other things that I found, or that I've found over the time that I've been with you, but also in reading some of those articles, is music at St. Mark's. Right, it's a big deal. Grace Brain, who was here in the 50s and 60s. We now have a fund that bears her name that helps pay for some things, music and worship related wise, right? This is like the musical equivalent of Bishop Mako, right here. Until her death, I guess she started playing while Grace Brain was here, and then so that's why I had her from the 60s. I couldn't find a complete date there until she died. So youth choir, cherub choir, junior choir, 3 choirs for youth. Like they were all named. So I'm guessing that cherubs were the really little. The youth was like elementary, middle, maybe, and junior choir was, I don't know, middle school, high school, and then we still have an adult choir today, right?
Cherub choir, I remember being in the room downstairs with like about 20 of us with those white things, the big red ties.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Fronta
right.
was in charge of us.
Oh, yeah.
So,
And then concerts. There was one thing. There was talk about St. Olaf Choir coming here and giving a big concert. I guess the choir did some things with the Wilmington Symphony. So a big part of the mission, the ministry of St. Mark's has been related to music. So how do you think the emphasis on music affected the mission and ministry of the congregation?
it was even beyond that because it was the organ.
Yes, the organ, right?
We replaced that, the pipe organ went up too.
Yeah.
I could be wrong, but I think it was Mary Arnold that had a lot to do with the organ.
I don't know.
She was the organist before. She was the organist at one time.
Before Liz.
Yeah.
And I heard from people that know a lot more than I do because I wasn't here, but they said that the organ, I call it, I'm doing a decimal because the fire takes cold air at the bottom and Well, how did it?
Yes, yeah. So there were reports that when the fire was coming through, that you could actually, it sounded like someone was playing the organ because the air was going through it.
Now
But
I
yeah,
cried.
yeah.
My girlfriend, my best friend was over at the school here, and she was in one of the front rooms, and she said it sounded like the organ cried.
Yeah.
And the church that I was raised in Michigan had the same fate. Their church burned down.
Yep.
I tried to find out if people heard that church.
Yeah.
I never did that one.
Yeah. So how does the musical legacy still live on today in our mission and ministry?
I think we have a terrific choir. Really.
What did you say?
That we have a terrific choir is which I'm just since I sing in the choir, I'm not like, those are not my words, those were Barbara's words. So
Right. There was something that was done a few years back, and Gail, Roger was very instrumental in getting that going, and where we had people from the community involved in a musical celebration for Candlemas.
okay.
Yeah.
And that was a really successful event. You know,
Right.
she reached out to people in the community to participate in the service.
Yeah.
It was
Sort of like what you've done a little bit with the Girl Scouts.
Right. Yeah.
Okay?
Uh-huh.
Same thing?
they were from the Wilmington Music School.
Yep. So still some ways that love that of music that is what has still been living out.
Well, let's face it, it's not the same.
It's not the
It's
same.
not.
It's not the same. No.
And it won't be the
Right.
same.
And I would say also another way that the musical legacy lives still on is through the contemporary worship as well, and being open to trying new things in worship, right? So for some of us who are like organ people, you know, we don't necessarily think about wanting to have guitars and keyboards and drums and, you know, basses and that, you know, but for some people that is the best way, that for some of us that is the better way to experience time worship of God. Yeah.
I think that now that you have started chanting that one portion of the liturgy, I think that's very interesting. I've never heard it done in other places, so it's interesting.
Yeah. So yeah, well, and I mean, yeah, how's the musical legacy live on? I mean, your pastor was a music major too, you know. So, you know, part of that is here in me too.
Yeah, and
right?
John is very creative.
Yes, right. Yes,
He's very creative. He can just write in what he needs to.
But for me, there's another side to all this. Maybe Janice was trying to get at that. There was a time, it had a lot to do with attendance, and it did have a lot to do with the emphasis on music and so forth, but there was a tremendous amount of energy when you came into the church. And the choir, I don't know how many voices the choir had at one time, but it was a lot.
Right.
Over 20. Yeah, over 20.
Yeah. So that there was a tremendous sense of, I'm just going to say, energy that one met when one came to church here. I'm keenly aware that that is not the same at this point, and I miss it.
Yeah.
And I miss it, and I have to, adapt, struggle within myself to find ways to, in a sense, work with myself for that to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, the energy is something that has changed here, right? And what used to be probably will never be again, at least not in that way, that same exact way. So the sooner that we kind of realize that and come to terms with that, I think the better we are. That doesn't mean that we can't be informed by all of this. That's why this stuff is important, because this has made us who we are today. But we can't just stay here, which is what next week will be about. How do we move forward? So I'm going to push through here. So the 50s and 60s, active youth program, a popular beach date where you got to go to the beach, I guess. I don't know. That was in one of your newsletter articles. I don't know. Annual spring fair, which sounds like it was kind of a precursor to today's bazaar. But again, booths built by the men of the church and decorated by the women of the church. So whatever was happening, people were invested in it, literally invested in it, right? And proceeds benefited the building fund. So planning ahead, thinking ahead. In the 70s to present, now this is the time that I kind of had to infer a lot of this based on some of these things that I looked at here. But a time, I would call that a time of growth and vitality. And the reason being, you had a multi-pastor staff during the 70s and 80s. If you're a congregation that needs more than one pastor, that means that you're large enough to support more than one pastor, right? And also, that's when pastors started serving longer terms, which we talked about before. So it's offering some stability. I know that Pastor Malco is going to be here next Sunday, and the Sunday after, and the Sunday after. So I can come and form a relationship with him, a pastoral relationship with him, because I know that he's going to be there and continue to support me and my family and however we might need him, right? So we talked about Pastor Fred was here for 22 years, right? That's what we said. Retires in 2014. When he retires, this is thanks to some of our long-range planning work I got, so. He notes that membership has actually been in decline for about 15 years when he retires in 2014. So it's been slow, it's been going down. Pastor Scott comes in 2016, and to say it was a difficult tenure is probably putting it very lightly. But I think part of it is, well, at least from the outside looking in, I think part of it is you're coming in in the middle of a decline, right? And you're coming in after a beloved pastor who was there for 20 plus years. The deck was stacked against him. I know that there are some among you who have very good reasons to be glad that he is gone. But he walked in with the deck stacked against him, too. So I feel like we need to address that and to say that. It was mutually not a good fit, but also it was a difficult situation that he was walking into. In 2017, he reported that the continued decline wasn't just happening at St. Mark's, but also the greater church. So it's not something that's just happening in this place, but elsewhere too. It's happening with our sister congregations, it's happening in the Synod, it's happening in the ELCA, it's happening worldwide. Yes. And he also noted the need for the church to adapt and develop leaders committed to transformation. I'm actually going to skip these questions here, because I want to get to 2020, the year that everything changed.
COVID.
Right? So, March 2020, COVID shutdowns, right? Congregations have to rethink how they are gathering, if they can gather. How are they going to share the good news, right? And St. Mark's, like so many other of our congregations, gets not, nudged into the 21st century, shoved full on into the 21st century.
Kicking and screaming.
Right, yes. To where we begin to offer online worship, we offer Zoom options for meetings and for educational time, and those things are still continuing. And we have people who participate in those things who never set foot in our congregations now. And how do we engage them is the question that we have to still be asking, right? It's great that we have this stuff, but yeah, Cheryl.
I just want to, I'm going to throw this out. So
Yeah.
I meant to mention this in worship, in the worship committee meeting the other night, and I completely forgot it because it was been that kind of a day. But my sister, who has visited at least, okay, she tunes in to the worship service every Sunday. She and her friend, male friend, tune into the worship service every Sunday,
Mhm.
and they were on vacation down in Mexico, and they still tune in.
Yep.
So, they're coming, they're usually in Idaho.
Yeah. It's
So it's there.
It's
People
re-
that have never looked at us except they're there.
it's forcing us as congregations to rethink what it means to be a member. Because now you don't even need to be in the same state as the church where you would attend worship. Like your sister is case in point. Robbie's dad is another. Robbie's dad will attend Tree of Life worship, online worship, rather than go to what was his home congregation in Columbus. So yeah.
One of the things we've noticed, one of the things that's been a blessing for like the Wednesday morning Bible study, we have a lot of people that go to Florida or wherever else they're going to go.
Right.
They can show up on Zoom. They just need, you know, an iPad or even their phone, and they can come in and do that.
Yeah.
And we've had meetings where people have not been in the state.
So there are limitations to some of that, right? Because sometimes it can be hard to kind of read the room when you're in Zoom and you're all in your own places, right? But it offers that way to be, or if, you know, someone's feeling sick and doesn't really want to come into a meeting, they can still join us via Zoom. Or you can, you know, if you, you know, like I've said before, our family is incredibly busy, and sometimes it's just easier for us to go and turn on the computer to attend a Zoom meeting than it is to physically pack up the family and drive to wherever it is that we need to go for that meeting, right? Because, you know, for example, if I have Abby with me, I've got to make sure that she's got stuff to entertain her so that I can pay attention to the meeting, right? But if we're at home, she has our whole room, all of that. I just set up on the dining room table, and, you know, it's a lot easier. The commute is a lot easier. We don't have to rush through if we're working, you know, if you work until 5 and the meeting's at 6:30, you know, you can take your time at dinner because all you have to do is turn on the computer or the tablet or the phone and join that meeting.
Since John is still here,
yeah,
I want to give him credit. He put this whole thing together.
Yeah.
I don't know how many remember that, but he put the whole thing on.
They've heard it.
Yeah.
And a lot of you.
And it was advantageous for us that we were already planning a lot of that live streaming stuff before
right.
COVID happened. So
you're right.
We literally had just placed the order for the cameras and the live streaming equipment for upstairs, like a couple of days before everything shut down.
Right.
And then that equipment became impossible to get.
Right. Yeah.
There's a piece of it that still aren't available.
I remember the early days, and Robbie and I were broadcasting worship from our phones because that's all we could get. I remember helping Robbie do something at his church, and we were filming on his phone, and it had decided to do it sideways, and we couldn't figure out how to not make it sideways. And so the entire I'm behind the phone, like, you know, kind of doing it, and I'm getting texts on my phone from my people who were watching it. It's sideways. We can't see it. And I'm like, I don't know how to fix it. I'm sorry. So yeah. Yeah. I mean, so we have come a long way from then, you know, but yeah. So I came, you called me in February 22. There was a time period. I started here June 1st. And then we have a long-range planning team that we met for the first time, I think, the beginning of 2023. Is that correct?
Yes, January.
Okay. Yeah. And so our goal is to consider a 3 to 5 year plan going forward that we're going to present to council later this spring, early summer. So some of that, you know, some of this that we've talked about today is going to inform that. Some of things that we're going to talk about next week are going to also inform that too. But also, so looking, looking ahead is what we're going at. So we are a little bit over, but are there any final comments or questions or anything kind of bubbled up then that you didn't think about before, but now you're like, oh, yeah. Yeah, Vicki.
From the time I grew up here, you know, so much has changed. We were at this church at least 2 to 3 times a week,
Mm-hmm.
including Sunday.
Yeah.
Sundays did not have sports and the rest of that morning. That's all changed. I did not have the homework. I had homework, but I did not have the homework that the kids have.
Yeah.
When I took over confirmation, that was something I ran into, is how much homework. At 7th and 8th grade level, the kids have. And now all the sports are on Sunday, so it's just, it's really hard to get the kids into the church because they have all these other things that are vying for their time. And when they go to college, the colleges want to see variety in the thing, and so that's it's just we're fighting against that.
So I think part of that too is this acknowledgement. I said 2022 is the year that the world changed, which it did, but it had been changing up to that point as well, right? There were many other things that were changing in the world before then. And I think oftentimes as the church, we look at how things used to be and think that's how they need to be now or going into the future. And that's where I think that 2020 really helped us, because 2020 said, none of that can work. None of that is viable and doable and sustainable anymore. So how are you going to do church different? As we think ahead, as we're kind of looking at this 3 to 5 year plan too, how do we take the reality of the world into that plan? And how do we, face the reality, look at the reality that we are facing, but also how do we not just say, well, this worked, we've always done church on Sunday morning, so church must always be on Sunday morning, and it can never be any other time than Sunday morning. Or we've always done, Lenten midweek, and so we have to always do Lenten midweek. Or we've always done this, or we've always done that. We're in a great time for that. I mean, Pastor Scott was on to something in 2017 when he said we needed some transformation among the leaders, and you all are leaders. It's not just the pastors, but all of you are leaders in some way in this congregation. We need transformation on all of us. So next week, we're going to kind of look at where we are now, which I kind of hinted at, and then where we might be going. So some of this, so for you who kind of wanted some answers tonight, we were looking at the past tonight. So next week, we'll be looking into the future. Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
One of the things, because I think it's really exciting that we can now we have 3 meetings that we're in that are all done via Zoom. And so it's great for small groups. You just pull that together. But the other thing is, for the lady that came in and did the winter forum from Minnesota, is that where she was from?
Yep.
Yeah. We had a wonderful presentation from somebody we would have had to pay to fly here and do, all that cost. She would have had to disrupt her schedule to come. She pops up on the screen, gives a wonderful presentation, and we have a discussion with her. Yeah. What a door-opening experience.
Yep. Yeah. So a new way of doing things, right? New isn't always bad. Old isn't always bad either. But 2020 was a hard year, but it also opened our eyes to the new ways that church can be expressed in the world, right? So we are definitely past time, and I know John probably wants to start choir. So is there someone who would be willing to pray us out of here? Not everyone's like.
I will.
Okay, thank you, Janice.
Let us pray. We thank you, Lord, for this day and for this church and for this congregation and for all that we have been through together, for new times and old times and good times and bad times. We appreciate all that you bring to us. We bring ourselves to you for your guidance in how we move and operate and share and care for each other. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you all.